Hi, everyone. My name is Devin Bean. I'm a physical therapist. I work primarily in a pediatric setting. I went to ISU a couple of years ago, and I'm going to help out with a discussion activity sort of thing related to sensory processing. Um, I can't be there in person this week, but I was asked to discuss some of these concepts. It's an area where I've done a lot of consideration in my treatments with the pediatric patients that I work with, and so I thought I could share some insight. I also had some opportunities to get a little extra education on this subject when I was on rotations and things in school. So it seemed like a pretty good fit. This is going to be like a pseudo lecture. Um, it's kind of like a part lab, part lecture activity. Since we're doing this on a recorded basis and you're pretty much doing it on your own, the activities are going to be somewhat limited, mostly brainstorming activities. But I think if you'll do a little bit of that brainstorming, that you'll feel like you maybe get a little bit of insight, and hopefully that this will help you if you have the opportunity to treat children in the future. I don't anticipate that many of you will be primarily pediatric therapists, and even as someone who works primarily in that population, sensory processing considerations are just that. They're a consideration. It's not the main goal of my treatment. And we'll get into that a little bit. So here's the objectives for what I'd like you to take away from this discussion activity. I want you to understand the basics of sensory processing disorder. This is a very general overview. Part of this is the literature regarding sensory processing disorder has been interpreted multiple different ways, and it's described in even more ways than that. So I'll give you a taste of what makes the most sense to me. We're going to differentiate between seekers and avoiders. This is the easiest way that I have found to sort of categorize children that seem to demonstrate some issues with sensory regulation. And this is just one way to categorize children, but I found it to be the most efficient for what I need to consider as a physical therapist. I also want you to recognize ways that sensory processing irregularities may present for all the senses. And when I say all the senses, I mean major senses like sight, hearing, taste, touch, vestibular inputs, and yeah, well, you'll see which ones I'm most concerned about as we get through the PowerPoint. I also want you to be introduced to sensory integration therapy, and I should also say sensory integration therapy considerations. This is not an intervention that you're going to be performing exclusively as a PT. There's some reasons for that. Again, I'll save that for when we get there in the presentation activity. The last thing is I want you to brainstorm and practice some ways that sensory techniques could be used to facilitate participation in your treatment. And that's really the ultimate purpose of this lecture activity, is to give you some tools in your tool belt if you happen to be working with a kid and the kid doesn't seem to want to participate, or is having a hard time, or is always kind of going crazy on you, or always sleeping on you. These are just some ways to try and get them to work with you a little bit better. And that's where I've had the most success with some of the sensory processing considerations, is in getting kids to participate in treatments better. So let's get into it. All right, so this is our background. This is a little bit more of the lecture part. This is what is sensory processing disorder. I will say I was influenced by some PowerPoints that Gloria has made. I really like this. What is sensory processing disorder and what it isn't. So let's focus on what it isn't first. Sensory processing is not the answer to all poor behaviors in children. And that's one thing that I was reminded of when I was reviewing literature on this subject, that people who believe in sensory processing tend to maybe go a little bit overboard in saying that sensory processing will describe every negative behavior in children. While I think it can be a good platform to describe many behaviors in children, I don't know that it's the answer to all poor behaviors in children. And that's pretty much how it's described in a lot of instances. Something else that it isn't is it's not a replacement for exercise training. And that's where we specialize as physical therapists. A lot of kids that have some of these sensory irregularities are also going to present with some motor problems, whether it's delays or just maybe some awkward movement patterns. And there's not really a substitute for good old exercise in some of those instances. Another thing I want to emphasize that sensory processing isn't is that it's not related to deficits or impairments or problems with the sensory pathways. I'm talking at receptor level to the brain. So if you remember those lovely drawings or pathways that maybe you did when you were studying for neuroanatomy, where you had the DCML and you go up to where the pathways go up in the spinal cord, they cross in the medulla and then go over to the associated cortical area. If there's a problem there, it's probably not a sensory processing disorder that the kid is working with. Same is true for the ALS system. I know there's like the other version that they emphasize is maybe more appropriate than the ALS, but that's the one I can remember. So if there's a problem with that pathway, it's probably not a sensory processing disorder that the kid's dealing with. It's probably just a sensation problem that the kid is dealing with. Sensory processing happens in the central nervous system after the sensory inputs have been received. It's how those inputs are then processed and utilized and associated in the brain that causes the sensory processing disorder. So some kids do have legitimate sensory, like receptor deficits, or some kids can have strokes. And if you damage the cortical area of the brain where that pathway terminates at, well, that's a sensation issue more than a sensory processing issue. So I wanted to differentiate that. The last thing that sensory processing is not, is it is not clearly defined. And I was scouring over several of my resources on this topic, and I remembered why I have a simplified version that I work with in my practice, and it's because it's all over the place. I'll give you a little bit more of a taste of one way that it's broken down. It's probably the most concrete way that I've seen sensory processing disorder broken down, but it still kind of seems a little bit funny. So we'll get into that. Let's talk about what sensory processing disorder is. It is a way to describe behaviors in children based on environmental inputs. So if you notice that your kid is fine a lot of the time, and all of a sudden you're in a new situation and your kid's like a total turd, well, it's probably because there's something in the environment that is setting them off. I don't know if any of you are parents. I have two really great children, and they definitely show some tendencies in this way. And so as a parent, I've used some of these considerations to try and facilitate better behavior in my children. And it works sometimes. That's something I want to emphasize is these sensory considerations, they're going to be good tools, but it's not going to work every time. So it's really important to work with parents and see what is helpful for children and what isn't. And parents are usually your best resource when you're trying to figure out how to facilitate better behavior in children. So we got into this next point just a little bit when talking about what sensory processing wasn't, but sensory processing does describe poor processing of sensory inputs at the central nervous system level. And that's because when our body goes through the process of receiving sensations, then it has to perceive those sensations. And there is a difference between sensation and perception. And sensory processing disorders usually happens when there's a mismatch between what's received and what's processed or what's perceived. And so when that's the case, kids often do demonstrate behaviors that aren't necessarily conducive to good physical therapy treatments. The last thing of what sensory processing disorder is it is a theory that can be used to assist treatment in children with difficult behaviors. And that's what we're going to focus on for pretty much the duration of this activity. So to give you just a little bit more context on what sensory processing is, since it seems kind of vague, I'm going to just let you know it is. Sensory processing is a very vague concept. The general definition that has satisfied me is it's that idea that a child can receive sensory inputs, and while that their central nervous system is trying to associate and perceive those inputs, there's a mismatch between what they perceive and what they feel, and that either they perceive too much or they don't perceive as much as what they have actually received the inputs for. And that's going to cause them to feel overwhelmed or underwhelmed. And they're going to try and regulate to find a just right amount. I teach an anatomy class at a local community college in Idaho Falls as well. And one of the things we talk about there is that our body seeks for things in just right amounts. We call it the Goldilocks principle. So you want just the right amount of oxygen, just the right amount of electrolytes. And when it comes to sensory inputs, we are looking for the just right amount. That's a little bit different for everyone. When we consider someone to have a sensory processing disorder, it's because they can't find that just right amount, and they're either seeking more inputs or avoiding inputs to find that just right amount is affecting their ability to move, their ability to appropriately display emotions, or to just function as a normal kid. Technically, these things can happen in adults as well. They're just more common in kids because kids are growing and some of those processes haven't developed yet. I'll describe more in just a little bit. So there are some subtypes of sensory processing disorders. Some are simply like how you just respond to sensory inputs. So we would call that sensory modulation disorder. And I've noted here, that's like typical sensory processing disorder. It's that basic mismatch. And we have different kinds where we've got over responders. So they get touched lightly, and to them, it feels like they just got gouged. They're going to avoid that kind of sensation. Or we've got our under responders, and that's where you touch them and they don't even notice. Like you've got to like really squeeze them for them to feel satisfied. So maybe you've got a kid that's like a really squeezy, clingy hugger. Well, maybe they're a little bit under responsive in that area. And so they're seeking that deep input to actually feel like they've been given a hug. And so then traditionally, we also see sensory seeking as another subtype of sensory modulation disorder. That doesn't make any sense to me because under responders very often tend to be seekers. So it's almost like a subtype of the subtype. But I don't write the literature, so I'm just telling you what I see. But how I understand it is that sensory seeking almost seems to be like a subtype of sensory under responsivity, or those under responders that don't tend to recognize the inputs that they're getting. They're going to tend to seek more of them. Another major subtype of sensory processing disorder is sensory discrimination disorder. And this is where you get inputs, you recognize you have them, you just can't recognize where they're coming from. And usually this manifests as like a postural disorder or dyspraxia. And really, this just kind of sounds like stuff that you would observe after a stroke. It's not very common that you're going to see major postural disorder like leaners or pushers outside of strokes, even in kids. They might have like poor slumpy posture, but when I say that, I hope you just adjusted in your own seat. So poor posture just kind of tends to be common in all of society nowadays. So I'm not exactly sure how I feel about this one. Some people will indicate that kids can have dyspraxias, and that can prevent them from gaining motor skills. Like I've heard of speech dyspraxias. Maybe there's something to that, but you may also be looking at something like a developmental coordination disorder if a kid really has a problem. And that's beyond just a sensory issue. There's some issues with multiple areas and pathways if you're dealing with like developmental coordination disorder. So this subtype, sensory discrimination disorder, I'm still deciding how I feel about that. Not like I determine the research. The framework with which they're describing it doesn't make a ton of sense to me. The last one is subtype of sensory processing disorder is sensory-based motor disorder. These are kids that tend to demonstrate developmental delays. And my thinking is, well, maybe it's just that. Maybe there's issues with the motor outputs as much as the sensory inputs. So it kind of depends on how you're coming to approach it. I'm going to draw you back to your neuro class just a little bit, where you talked about different strategies or types of neuro treatments. If you remember, there's like the NDT or neurodevelopmental treatment, which is really hand over hand and guiding. And then there's, task specific training, which is you kind of like set them up and let them go on their own. So those are both different frameworks to think of neuro-based treatments with patients or patients with neurological conditions. And sensory processing disorder theory is a way to think about facilitating better motor skills and emotional skills and behavioral skills in children. And it's a theory and it's a framework. So for my purposes, I want you to be aware of these subtypes, but it doesn't affect how I consider these things in my practice. So I wouldn't expect it to affect your practice either. I just want you to be aware of to maybe improve your conversations with like occupational therapists or other medical professionals who may think in these terms or framework. So when would you consider using some sensory strategies with children? Well, I would consider to use them in my treatments when I start to notice a lot of negative behaviors in treatment, especially poor attention. So if a kid just seems to not pay attention to me, then I'm going to try and use some of the strategies that are often described in sensory processing literature, because they tend to help kids focus or at least be motivated to participate. And maybe that's just what it is. But I have had quite a bit of luck getting kids to participate better when they demonstrate some of these initial poor behaviors. Another time it can be really helpful is when that kid has problems with arousal. So maybe they're too sleepy. You see them, they just kind of like are dopey or mopey, or maybe they're just, kind of asleep. I've had that, especially with infants. And there's some things you can do to get that person to wake up a little bit. There is an optimal level of arousal for treatment. And if you're trying to do things with a kid when they're too tired, it's not going to work. But if you also do it when they're maybe a little bit wild and crazy, it's also not going to work. This is one where if you're a parent, you'll probably know what I'm talking about. Because when you try and do things with your kid, you can tell when they're too tired and you can tell when they're a little bit too wound up. And so these sensory processing techniques we'll talk about can be effective in getting them to more of an appropriate state of arousal. Another time I might use sensory processing considerations in my treatment is if they have tics. And maybe these aren't true tics like in Tourette syndrome, but maybe they just do some weird things. I might try these. Some kids with autism disorder demonstrate stemming activities, and that is related to sensory processing disorder. I am going to draw a little circle here. I want the black. So if we're talking about sensory processing disorders, excuse my poor mouse handwriting. So if this is the circle of sensory processing disorder here, children with autism disorder are going to be within that circle. It's not the other way around. So this is A is for autism spectrum disorders. There are lots of kids that are going to demonstrate some poor sensory regulation that don't have autism disorder. So if you see a kid that, maybe doesn't regulate themselves very well, that doesn't mean they have autism. It probably just means that they're learning how to be a human. But kids with autism disorder, I guess I should have extended this out just a little bit because there's some that don't. But many of them do demonstrate issues with the sensory regulation. So just wanted to point that out there. So I do have some handouts, and these are things I'll use if I really suspect that there's a potential sensory issue. Then I'll hand these handouts to my parents. And I recognize that you can't really see this on the PowerPoint. So I've included these as PDFs of their own, and hopefully you got those or can see them that they've been posted on Moodle. So here's a clearer version to see. So these are just, this is a questionnaire I might have a parent fill out if I'm noticing some significant behaviors interfering with treatment. And then they can circle the associated items that like, oh man, my kid really struggles with these areas. Sometimes they might like do a whole column. So like I've done looked at some of these with my own kids, and they tend to fall here. Not all the way though. Like it's not like they're lethargic, but they like crash into things. They are really high energy. They miss auditory and visual cues, so things like this, it's like they get a lot here. Yeah, so then this is like postural and motor difficulties. It's like, oh, look, low muscle tone. Well, sometimes that's the sign of like a real medical condition. So again, it's not perfect, but it gives me an idea of what I'm working with from a parent's perspective if the kid is demonstrating some really difficult behaviors. So I have one of those for kind of like your general kids, and then I have one specific to infants and toddlers. This is like your 3 years and younger group. And so these are, things that can be helpful if you notice you're struggling to connect with a kid. This can give you some information to better meet that kid's sensory needs, so to say, and it'll probably improve your interactions and treatment with them. So this is just, telling you to refer to those handouts. If you are suspecting something with the parent, have them fill this out, and you can kind of see trends of what that kid struggles with. One thing I do want to point out is it's very unlikely that they're going to just fill out one row. They'll probably have several in one row, but others throughout. In that case, when I was taking my class on this, the occupational therapist presenting said, your job as a physical therapist, it was also for speech therapists or speech therapist, is not to interpret, this handout. It's to recognize that, a lot of circles indicates a sensory problem and then work with an OT. Sometimes you have that luxury and sometimes you don't. The titles up here on the handouts kind of let you know if they are super sensitive, if they're seekers, if they're avoiders, which is going to be similar to being super sensitive. And then this low registration is another term you might see often in sensory processing literature. And I think that's just people that it's almost like another subtype of like under responders. They don't respond because they don't really process it, but then they are not really seeking it. That's how I understand it too. Again, you're getting a lot of flavor a la Devin with some of this stuff because it's kind of vague and difficult to understand. And a lot of times when I've asked occupational therapists about it, they're like, yeah, that's a decent idea. You should send the kid over to me. They spend a lot more time talking about this stuff in the occupational therapy world, and I'm okay with that. I just want to use some of these considerations to improve my treatments. I don't want it to be the focus of my treatment. All right, so we're going to talk about seekers and avoiders. I'm hoping you appreciate my graphics to emphasize this point. The reason we're going to talk about seekers and avoiders is because this is the simplest way that I have found to think about sensory processing disorders. We tend to notice kids that are seeking extra sensations, or we have kids that are avoiding extra sensations. And that's your two most common presentations of sensory processing disorders. So we got our seekers, and you try and avoid the dementors. I'm not a super Harry Potter fan, but I know that lots of people are, which is, I don't know, this seemed like the best way to kind of illustrate that point. If I was going to show you a real life example of seekers and avoiders, I'm going to show you some pictures of my family. So you can see this red line in the middle here. That is separating the seekers versus the avoiders in my family. So those two cute kiddos on the side, that's my daughter. Her name's Ivy. She just turned 6. And my son, Jimmy, is a little over 1.5 years old. And then there's me. And all three of us tend to demonstrate some real sensory seeking tendencies. And as I look back on my own life and some of the things I did as a kid and some of the things I do now, um, I can see that um, I'm seeking some sensory inputs in some domains. And my kids tend to seek them in the same domains, and they tend to be in the movement domains. Um, the fact that I'm going to make it through this PowerPoint sitting and recording it is pretty miraculous, because at work, I can handle about maybe 15 minutes sitting down before I have to get up and move somewhere. And that's even like when I'm documenting, because I just can't stand it after a while. It's like I haven't moved and my body feels that need to move. That's not necessarily like a bad thing to be driven to move, but for some kids, when they can't sit still and they're fidgeting through class and stuff, it can be really disruptive for them. So hopefully by the time we're done with this, you'll feel like you have some tools in your tool belt that can help a kid get through a session, and maybe some of those strategies might help them get through a school day. Um, so my wife, on the other hand, tends to be an avoider. That doesn't mean that she like won't go on hikes and stuff with us, but her choice would be to, read a book, where my kid's choice would be, or as my daughter likes to play, sports all. So just kind of even the preferences of kids' activity choices might give you an indication if they tend to seek things or avoid things. Now, that being said, when I'm talking about seeking and avoiding, I'm generally referring to a kinesthetic sense here, because all of us in my family tend to avoid super strong auditory stimuli. And that's a point that needs to be emphasized, that someone may be a seeker in one category or one sensation, and they may be an avoider in another. And that's kind of where we're going to get headed right now, after we define these just a little bit more. So seekers, since this is kind of my framework, a lot of what you're going to get here is my observations based on some of my understanding of the literature. So seekers tend to be under responders. They're people who need a little bit more input than average, and they want it to feel balanced or in that just right place. I've also noticed that seekers tend to be distracted. In some extreme cases, they may be seeking so much that they might engage in self-harm, but that's a little bit more rare. What's a lot more common is that they're going to be on the go, especially if they're like a proprioceptive seeker. They're going to be moving because that's what they want to feel. And so in some cases, even if they do move a lot, this is the kid that like won't sit still. He's crashing into stuff, rolling around. Even if they're doing all that movement, they might have some troubles with some really fine control or coordination. So yeah, maybe they're like, chucking rocks all the time, but they might do it really poorly. And that's because they're not really integrating very well what's happening when they move. They're not paying good attention to it. They just want to feel that they're moving. So sometimes that is the case. It's not always the case. But one thing that is generally true is that they need lots of redirection, and that's because it's hard for them to sit still. So yeah, your seekers might be your hyperactive kids, or I'm not going to say it hasn't happened, but there could be a kid with a sensory processing disorder who's a seeker, who really, maybe they really have ADHD, or maybe they have ADHD, but they're really just a seeker. I can see how there's some real similarities in that presentation. And depending on who you talk to, they might just say, yeah, it's all a manifestation of poor sensory regulation. I don't know. I'm not the one who makes those diagnoses. I just tend to work with them when they're delayed. So avoiders are kind of the opposite. Hopefully you can, make that assumption at this point. They tend to be hypersensitive, or they over-respond. So even the slightest touch, the littlest noise, dim lights, they're all overwhelming. So they're going to avoid things. These are the kids that might cover their ears. They're going to close their eyes or squint, because they're trying to minimize the sensations coming to them, because it's overwhelming when they process them. These kids tend to cry a little bit more often because they get overwhelmed. And when you're little and you feel overwhelmed, really the mechanism that happens first is you cry. This isn't to say that seekers don't cry. Also, avoiders just cry more, in my experience. These kids are generally picky, like picky eaters that only eat certain textures or even certain colors or certain flavors. I've noticed that some of my avoiders tend to not even want to move, or they'll only wear certain types of clothes because anything else just is overwhelming to them. These kids tend to need encouragement more than they need redirection. Um, yeah, so this is really based on my experience, and it matches quite well with what I've seen in literature. So kids could seek or avoid in their various senses. When I was in PT school, we did a neuro assignment where we had to like break down as a class like 25 senses, and that kind of blew my mind because I was like, don't we have like 5 senses? You know, that's what I always grew up hearing. Well, we do know that there's maybe a little bit more than just 5, senses. But these are the senses as a physical therapist that you're probably going to notice being sought out or avoided with kids in your treatments. So there's olfactory, what you smell; gustatory, what you taste; visual, what you see; auditory, what you hear; tactile, which is what you touch or what touches you; proprioceptive, how your body moves and where it is; and then vestibular, I have where you are. It's really specifically where your head is and what your head is doing. Um, so these are the senses that you're going to notice kids seeking or avoiding in your treatments with them. So some of these we can do something about. So visual, auditory, tactile, proprioceptive, and vestibular inputs, we can modify things in the environment to facilitate participation in treatment. Tactile, proprioceptive, and vestibular inputs, we can even go one step further and design interventions that specifically address those systems to facilitate our treatments as well. Technically, I guess you could maybe squeeze in visual there, but unless you're doing some specific eye training, which I've done a little bit of, it's most likely that you're going to be doing these bottom 3. So we're going to focus on these starred interventions, either single star or double star, for most of the rest of our conversation. So how would a seeker or an avoider present in these different senses? That's what we're going to talk about now. So in olfaction, seekers or under-responders may not be bothered by stinky smells, even to the point where like they could have bad body odor because they just don't even notice it. And this is even more than like being nose blind to something. There's something to like not recognizing your own smell, or like, you walk into your house and it doesn't smell like something, but you walk into someone else's house and it like smells way weird. That's a little bit of the nose blindness, but like someone who has low registration of their olfaction, nothing's gonna really smell that different to them. Whereas an avoider isn't even going to be able to tolerate like anything slightly stinky. So perfume could be overwhelming. And certainly if you have bad breath, it's going to like drive that person off the wall. As far as gustation goes, seekers are going to like really intense flavors. They might like bitter foods. They could like spicy foods. They might also just like the sensation of things in their mouth. So they could be like, putting their fingers or their hands in their mouths all the time. They might be chewing on things, if you've ever seen a kid that just is like always chewing. There's also some considerations of, well, is that just, they stuck in the oral phase, like the psychologist might say. I don't know. They might just really like that sensation of how things taste, or kind of the mouth sensations. We could get into that being tactile a little bit, but we're just going to kind of rely on the fact that lines are blurry. Avoiders, on the other hand, are going to be super picky eaters because it tastes weird or it doesn't feel right when I'm eating. And they're not going to like things that are hot, as in spicy, but they're also not going to like things that are hot in temperature. They're going to like tepid, bland foods. Thankfully, my kids are not gustatory avoiders because that would be really, really hard for me. So what I want you to do at this point, I want you to refer to that list I showed you earlier, this one with all the senses here. And for the remaining senses that have the stars, I want you to do some brainstorming. I want you to think of how a seeker or an avoider would present for the remaining senses. So I'm going to let you pause the YouTube video yourself, jot down those senses, jot down one or two things for each of the senses that you might think be how a seeker presents or how an avoider presents, and then we'll come back and you can see if it matches what I've got. All right, so hopefully you took some time to write out those senses and do some brainstorming about what you think a seeker and how you think an avoider would present. So visual seekers are going to be very easily distracted by television. They're going to like shows, they're going to like movies, they're going to like bright lights, they're going to like bright colors. Those are kids that really like that visual input. Now, this is a little bit funny. You might be like, well, that's like every kid. You're not wrong. A lot of kids tend to show some visual seeking behaviors. And I think part of that's just the way society is now. We're so screen timed that it's like kids get desensitized from too much screen time too early on. And so then they seek it out. That's like a parental observation. Do some more looking into that research. And I guess if you find something awesome, let me know. Because that's kind of one of my personal hypotheses. Avoiders, there are avoiders, and I have seen these as well. They're going to close their eyes a lot. They're going to squint. They're going to avoid the TV shows. If someone's wearing a bright dress, it's going to be scary to them. If you're like a crazy shirt, it's going to be intimidating to them. And so there are, two ends of the spectrum that we need to consider as far as these sensations go. So you're going to notice I just have a few things written. There's no like set list of how this is going to present. I'm just trying to give you opportunities to recognize that every kid is different to facilitate your treatments with them. So auditory seekers and avoiders. Seekers are going to be making a lot of noise because they want it. So if you know someone who hums a lot or whistles a lot, or if they talk really, really loud, maybe they shout a lot or they just like scream and they just giggle with it, they're probably an auditory seeker, because those inputs are satisfying, something they're searching for. Whereas your avoiders are going to plug their ears, they're going to cry with loud noises, they're going to get really distracted in busy places and maybe look a little bit intimidated because there's so much coming in that it's overwhelming them. So tactile seekers, this is the touch sensations. These are the kids that touch things. They want to feel everything. How does that feel? How does that feel? What about that? I think a really classic presentation is the kid that like runs their hand on the wall so they can feel all the bumps and the grooves. They like all that input, all of those things they're feeling. They're gonna love really extreme things like slime or mud or that kind of stuff. Whereas your avoiders are gonna want the clean hands. They're gonna like certain types of clothing. They're probably going to dislike things like tags on their clothes. And you may have a kid that demonstrates some seeking and some avoiding even within the same sense, which is why this is like such a not exact science. So we're just making some generalizations here to hopefully make your life a little bit easier. I do want you to understand that each kid is different and you're going to have to tailor those interventions. And sometimes you're going to figure something out and it's going to be awesome. And you're going to try it again with a different kid and it's not going to work. So hopefully you're prepared to do a little bit of brainstorming and you're okay with a little trial and error. All right, so proprioceptive seekers. These kids are going to run everywhere. They're going to crash into things. These are the ones that are on the go. This is what I live with. And it can be really, really, really fun. It can also be exhausting as a parent. Your avoiders, on the other hand, are going to be the still, calm children. I say calm in quotes here because they might just, not that lazy is the right word, but they're going to avoid those movement sensations because it's overwhelming. They may walk slow. They're probably going to prefer to just be like held and sit on your lap, which is also really sweet, but can also be overwhelming as a parent if the kid's only going to want to sit on you. Our last sensation is vestibular. Your seekers are going to spin, swing, jump. They're going to like roller coasters, maybe a little bit of your thrill seekers here, whereas your avoiders aren't even going to want to stand on a piece of foam because it's going to freak them out. They're going to want to feel really supported. especially like their head. So there, I have actually a kiddo right now who's struggled with some head control because he doesn't even want to move his head because that freaks him out so bad. And these kids are not going to like swinging. So, you rock a baby to, help calm them down or whatever. You're gonna have to be really careful how you rock that baby if they're an avoider, or maybe a baby that really hates rocking. Maybe it's because they've got some vestibular crazy stuff going on. So that's kind of an introduction as to what sensory processing disorder is and how it may present with various senses in kids. So how do we approach it as physical therapists? Hopefully this is where you can really take away a couple of clinical pearls, as James likes to say. Well, first I need to teach you about sensory integration training. There is a specific CPT code, 97533. So it's like right next to therapeutic activities. And this is the name of the code, sensory integration training. It is sensory processing disorder specific treatment. Typically, this is performed by OTs. So if you're going to bill under this code, it tends to be performed by OTs. You could always make the argument that there's a lot of crossover in pediatric treatment. But even understanding that there is a lot of overlap, I've never billed for this code. And I don't know if Gloria or Joe have either, and probably not, because if you look down our next point, it is a non-reimbursable code. So Medicaid, Medicare, they are not going to pay for the use of that code. And that's because this stuff is still considered experimental. There hasn't been enough isolated research on sensory processing interventions by themselves that suggest that they're effective. And this is like compared to therapeutic activities or therapeutic exercise. And so I don't expect to be billing sensory integration therapy, probably even anytime soon, especially as a PT, because it's such a specialized intervention that they're still learning about. I'm not going to say that this CPT code won't be reimbursed one day. We just need a lot more evidence to support that by itself, it's effective. And so this is a unique treatment code because it's specifically focused on sensation inputs and responses. And that's it. Whereas like therapeutic exercise, well, you can consider some sensory strategies while still performing exercise. So sensory considerations are really easy to throw in with other treatment codes, which doesn't really support the use of this code by itself. Yeah, so be aware that this is a specific isolated treatment, but it's not one you're probably going to be doing as a physical therapist, at least not in the near future. So how can we use sensory techniques with our pediatric patients, or why should we? Well, it's really helpful for kids with sensory issues, and that's not just kids with autism. It could be kids, like my daughter, who's always running and crashing into things and not listening, but she doesn't have autism. That doesn't mean she doesn't listen very well, or that she doesn't do some things that aren't typical for other kids. So, as a parent, I've had to use some of these things, and I would say with some success. Another thing to note is that many kids with intellectual disabilities respond well to these techniques or these sensory considerations in treatment. So I would emphasize that these techniques or these ways of thinking should be a supplement to your motor-based goals. So when you make a plan for the kid, you should focus on their movement dysfunctions. What can't they do? What is hard for them when they're moving? What's odd? And address those things. And then in the back of your mind, be thinking, is this because that's scary for them? Or is this because it's overwhelming for them to do this? And how can I get them used to that? Or, man, are they just not good at this because they get bored with it really fast? How can I make this more engaging for this kid when we're working on this goal? Because they might not be great at throwing because it's really boring for them, because they would like to do other things. They'd like to move in other ways that are more satisfying for them. So just think about that when you're doing treatments with kids. I feel like the big plug of sensory techniques is, make it fun, make it directed play that matches what they want. So really, it just comes back to play. And I'm sure you've heard that a couple of times from Gloria and from Joe that, you really need to make your interventions play-based. And that's really kind of the song of a sensory processing disorder treatment. It says you need to do fun things that appeal to them. We're just doing it in the frame of that appeal to the senses that they're either seeking or that they're avoiding. Some of these techniques can be arousing or calming based on what you need. That tends to be through the use of vestibular inputs, and we will talk about that just a little bit later. Sometimes I'll use these as a reward. I didn't know, sometimes I'll use these techniques as a reinforcement of better behavior. So if I have a kid who is being a little bit of a stinker, I'll have them do something that's really hard, or maybe we will do some like swinging that's uncomfortable for them, because they know that it's trying to reinforce appropriate behaviors in treatment. It's not like you can, punish a kid in treatment, but you can do things to reinforce their good behaviors and to discourage bad behaviors in your treatment. That's appropriate. Just make sure that you're doing it in a therapeutic sense. All right, so regulating activities. This is the meat of what I hope you take away from sensory processing. When a kid has sensory irregularity, we want to help regulate them. So for the seekers, we want to give them the inputs they're looking for. For avoiders, we want to not go too far. And we want to find out where that is and expand it. So this also has to do with arousal. This is for kids that are like sleepy or have a low level of arousal. We can heighten them so they'll be more engaged. Or those kids that are like way over the top, we can bring them down. Super overstimulated, we can bring them to a level where they will focus and work with us. So these activities are different for each of the senses. There is sort of a catch-all, and it's this heavy work you see on the slide, and those are proprioceptive activities. The way this was described to me when I was in a class on this is, when in doubt, have them do something that's heavy work, because it'll help regulate them no matter what their regulation dysfunctions are. And it seemed kind of funny, but I have applied it in my own practice and it's been pretty successful. So let's talk about some considerations for visual needs. Rather than doing things in terms of seekers and avoiders, we're going to do stimulating versus calming. And so these are, if I had an avoider, I'm probably going to tend towards here. If I have a seeker, I'm probably going to tend towards the stimulating. Hopefully that makes sense. It just felt more natural to define things in these terms when talking about the sensations. So also note that here on visual considerations, this is probably an environmental adaptation rather than specifically what you're doing in treatment. This is going to influence the environment in which you're treating. So if you need to stimulate the kid, or if they're seeking stimulation or they have low arousal, you're going to want to use bright colors, bright lights, busy backgrounds. If they're way stressed because they're overstimulated, or if they are going crazy, you might want to try some neutral tones or soft lighting and quiet backgrounds to improve their focus and attention. So hopefully you're kind of getting the vibe that these considerations for treatment should make a lot of natural sense. My purpose and hope today is to just draw your attention to them. All right, so auditory considerations. And again, we're going to put this in the realm of environmental adaptations. If you need to, inspire and stimulate a little bit, then maybe you use music with a fast, distinct beat. This is going to be maybe a little bit of a loud beat. Asymmetrical beats, that's like your boom ba, boom 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 ba, boom ba, boom 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 ba. That's going to be more arousing than something that's really symmetrical and maybe even monotonous, like boom 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 boom. Hopefully you even could just yourselves tell the difference in excitement between those two different beats. Other things is to consider the sound of the music that maybe you would select. So brass timbre is trying to emphasize this is like trumpets, horns, loud things. They're going to be more stimulating versus what we call string timbre. I should say this word Timbre is pronounced timbre, and it just is referring to the quality of sound. So string timbre is referring to things like violins and cellos, maybe even flutes. and they're soft and they're quieter. I mean, they can get loud, but they're softer and they're a little bit easier on the ears versus a brass timbre, which is like a trumpet or a tuba even. Um, Saxophone kind of falls over here. This is also more like if you're talking really loud and you open your mouth really wide, that's going to be more here versus if you talk a little bit deeper in your chest is going to feel more in that string timbre. So even how you talk to the kid, um, you can kind of change your tone to be a little bit, maybe a little bit brighter or a little bit darker and lower. And that can have an effect on the kid based on what they need. So for some tactile considerations, these are things. This one's kind of, it was on the line of environmental adaptation and treatment based. I didn't put environmental adaptation because you can do some things where they're touching stuff, but it's going to be a lot of the equipment you use. So maybe you use spiky balls that they're going to catch and throw because they like that more than just something plain. Maybe you're going to have them balance while they manipulate slime or something like that. Maybe you have them feel something hot or cold. And when I say extremes, please know that I mean within a safe level. I don't want you to do anything that could burn or give the kid frostbite. It just needs to be, enough that they can tell it's warm and tell it's cold. Maybe you do something like that. Maybe you do like a cold water balloon and a warm water balloon just to kind of like keep them engaged and they want to know which one they're catching. Versus if you are trying to calm, maybe you could do this neutral warmth. Sometimes that involves like a really like light vest that gives them just like a really gentle squeeze. It can kind of get them to their own body temperature, and that can be calming for kids that are maybe having a bit of a moment, like they're having a meltdown because they're overwhelmed, or that are going crazy and we need to bring them back down. You could try like some neutral warmth. Maybe you use soft fabrics or you do things on a soft surface that's more comfortable for them. And maybe you use smooth things instead of spiky things. So this one's kind of on the realm of environmental adaptations too. Where we're really want you to think, and I am going to give you a minute to do some brainstorming, is this proprioceptive heavy work. You'll notice that I have this slide set up a little different than the other sensations. And that's because most proprioceptive activities fall into the category of heavy work. These are challenging activities, things that are hard. And the reason I don't have calming versus stimulating is because they're both. Heavy work is considered calming, but it's also considered stimulating. And that's why this should be the bread and butter of your physical therapy considerations when it comes to sensory stuff, is when in doubt, do a heavy work activity and you're probably going to get a good response from the kid. So what are heavy work activities? This is push-ups. These are your weighted sled pushes, your heavy leg presses. Maybe you have them ride a bike or a trike and you resist them, so they have to use their muscles really hard. And if a kid is, kind of excited and a little hyper, this is going to actually help bring them down. But if they're maybe being timid and hesitant and you can get them to do this, then it's going to engage them a lot more. And I have seen both of those in my clinical practice. It seems a little bit funny, and anytime there's a catch-all, it makes me question the science maybe just a little bit, but I'm not going to argue with the clinical results. And so when in doubt, have them do something that's maybe just a little bit challenging. This is also great because a lot of these challenging activities could relate directly to your goals. One thing to say is, if you're going to have them do push-ups, maybe disguise it. My favorite way to disguise push-ups is to get their legs on like a peanut ball, and then have a bowling ball, like a soft playground ball, and have them like go down and hit it with their heads and then try and knock over bowling pins. I call it head bowling. Maybe I need to think of a better name. But it's getting kids to do push-up motions over and over, and that's really hard for them, but it's also really fun and it's engaging. So when you take some time to brainstorm activities you could, do for each of the senses, maybe spend a little extra time on this one and think of some really fun, heavy work activities you could do with kids, because this is where you're going to get the most bang for your buck, so to say. All right, we're going to exit. There we go. We're moving again. All right. So then vestibular inputs have the longest lasting effect with regard to arousal. So If you want to, wake up a kid, or maybe they're a little bit hyper and you want to kind of tip them over the edge, then you could do something really fast, like spinning, or have them swing back and forth, or have them jump up and down. Maybe you have them on like a rolly scooter and you're going in a whole bunch of different ways and it doesn't have a clear pattern. That's going to be really stimulating. And you got to be careful with that, because if you overstimulate the kid, they're either going to like start crying, or it's going to, in the case of my kids, make them go crazy. And because they tend to be on the seeker side of things, they're going to just want more and more and more and more. And it's really hard to tip them over the edge. You're going to have to go a lot farther. And then that might take too much time in your treatment. Another thing to do would be is to calm. If you're worried about overstimulating a kid, or a kid seems a little overstimulated, you could do some calming vestibular motions to maybe bring them down to a lower level. And this is the slow stuff, the rocking motions. Maybe you have them be on really firm surfaces so they feel grounded. Those are things to consider. One note is, if you choose the wrong thing with vestibular, if you calm down a kid that's already a little bit low, you might make them sleepy and you may not get them back. And the same thing goes for the opposite. If a kid's a little heightened and you think, oh, maybe I'll tip them over the edge and then they'll calm down again. If you don't tip them over the edge, they're just going to be extra crazy, and that's going to last for a while. So be cautious with your vestibular stuff. And it's okay if you make mistakes. Just know it's going to affect your treatment if maybe you do make a mistake with a vestibular choice. And I have, and it's helped me learn that sometimes you'll choose something that seems to fit just right, and it'll be the wrong thing, and you're going to have to adjust for that kid specifically. So what I want you to do again is I want you to pause. I want you to look back at those senses. I want you to come up with some of your own environmental considerations to stimulate or to calm. I want you to think of your own treatment ideas of things you could do that are calming and stimulating. And that's the framework. I want you to write those ideas down for yourselves. The purpose of this is, again, not to make you sensory integration specialists, but to help you feel a little bit more prepared when working with kids. Like, okay, if the kid's going crazy, I can try this. So I don't have a ton of activities because, or like the right things to do, because there's not really a right thing to do. And you taking the time to brainstorm is going to be as helpful as anything. So pause the YouTube video now, take a chance to write down some considerations yourself. If you're feeling short on time and you don't want to pause very long, at least brainstorm some heavy work activities in that proprioceptive category that you could have kids do. All right, so we're going to wrap up here. I just want to talk through a couple of case examples. I'm only giving you the information for the case because I want you to write down your own thoughts. And that's because there's no real right answers when it comes to this stuff. So case example 1, we have a 2-year-old boy. Actually, before I get into this, I want to mention this is an actual patient that I am currently working with. So yeah, so just like to show you that this is real. So case example 1, 2-year-old boy. We're in the process of getting a formal diagnosis of what is going on right now. We're functioning under developmental delay. He is way more sedentary than the average child. Some of that's because he's huge. He's way bigger than he should be for his age. And he has a huge head. He does have really poor head control and really bad core control. His favorite thing to do is to sit on mom's lap. And that's about it. He can walk, finally, and he'll throw things. It's more of like a chuck away from him. And he doesn't really do much else with regard to like playing with toys or interacting. He is terrified of anything that is not a really firm surface or like sitting pressed against his mother. And when I pick him up, he like holds on to me super tight, like he's terrified. So I want you to think, would you consider him more of a seeker type kid or more of an avoider type kid? Well, I consider him an avoider based on how he presents. He doesn't want to move. He's avoiding movement. He also is like a picky eater. he kind of demonstrates a lot of avoiding tendencies in most of his senses, which isn't necessarily typical, but it's how this kid presents. What really stands out to me is he tends to be a proprioceptive and a vestibular avoider. And I note the vestibular avoider because if I have him sit on a therapy ball and I tip him like right or left, forward or back, like I can go maybe like an inch each direction. And if I go more than that, we get to the point of a meltdown. And I say that because we've had meltdowns a lot. So, what would you do for that kind of a kid? Think about that for a minute. If you'd like, pause the video, write some things down, do a little brainstorming, and then I'll tell you what I'm trying. And not because it's necessarily right, but it's what I'm hoping will help. All right, if you took some time to pause, then I'm going to tell you what I'm doing with this kid. So the biggest areas where he tends to be an avoider is in proprioceptive areas and in vestibular areas. So as far as the heavy work activities I'm trying to do, I'm trying to have him go up and down things. We can walk, but stairs are really hard. So I'm trying to have him do things like go up and down to increase the challenge. That's inclines, declines, it's stairs. He does cry a lot when we do those things. And the up and down doesn't really seem to stop that, but he is getting a little bit stronger. I think one thing I might try is I'm going to get like a weight vest that kind of squeezes him a little bit. And I'm going to see if that will give him some like input also to help him feel a little bit more secure. That's been on my plan for the past couple weeks. He also gets sick a lot, and his family had COVID. So I haven't seen him for a bit because they're getting over that. But that's how my plan to do is to kind of give him a not super heavy weight vest because he is just like 2, but a little bit of a weight vest with a little bit of a compression to see if that will help him feel more secure. And then we're going to keep going up and down. The other thing I'm doing for some of his vestibular avoidance is I am doing a little bit of some desensitizing activities. So we do sit on the ball, or if he sits on my lap, I don't let him lay on me. I have him sit out, and he really hates that. He'll like throw his head back. And when he throws his head back, I catch it gently, but kind of lower it. Like if he's on the ball, he'll throw his head back, kind of catch it, lower it on the ball. And then when his head, I leave it upside down for a little bit and I'll just kind of rock him gently on the ball in different directions. Really slow because I don't want to freak him out too bad. But I do move him and he doesn't really love it. But he is getting a little bit better with it. He's tolerating a little bit more movement than where we started. We couldn't handle very much at all when we started. Now we can do a little bit. So that's giving me enough hope that some of this desensitization of his vestibular system is working. Again, I don't know if that's right, but that's what I'm doing. I'm tending towards some of these calm considerations of my vestibular inputs because they're lower as far as heightening, and anything I do is going to freak him out. So I'm doing a lot of things that are calm, with the exception of firm surfaces. I need him to be able to like walk on grass and stuff like that. So we do a lot on foam surfaces. But when I do rocking or if I do move him or swing him, we go very slow and we go in very consistent patterns because even that is almost overwhelming for him. So that's some thoughts from me on this case. Hopefully you had your own thoughts. Feel free to think about it a little bit more, maybe get together with a peer and do some more brainstorming. What would you do? If you have an awesome idea, please let me know. I would love some ideas. All right, case example 2. This is our last one. We're going to wrap up here. We got a 6-year-old girl. She doesn't have autism. That's what the ASD, no ASD diagnosis, no autism. You have a goal that you're working with her to catch a ball with her hands only. She's really distracted. She doesn't listen very well. Her mom reports that she's always running and crashing into things. You notice that she's a little bit fidgety, tends to have a lot of high energy. All right, so how does this kid present? Would you consider them more of a seeker or more of an avoider? Think about what you would do to work on that goal of catching with hands. What are you going to do to help this kid focus and work on catching with hands? So take a moment, pause the video, and write down some ideas. All right, hopefully you took some time to pause the video and write down your own ideas. I'm going to tell you what I think about this kid. So this kid looks a lot like a proprioceptive, maybe a little bit of a vestibular seeker, very much in contrast to the last kid. And so what I've been doing with this kid is we'll do a heavy work activity before we work on catching. Sometimes we'll run. That's a little dicey because running can be considered heavy work, but running fast sometimes heightens her and then she gets a little extra crazy. What I need to do is like resist her running. And then it would be hard, but we wouldn't get as much like head input back and forth, especially for running in circles. If we could run in lines with some resistance, that would be a better heavy work activity for her. We just don't always have the space. Like squats with weights, that's something else we've tried. We've tried push-ups. We're not very good at them yet, so we'll keep working on that. Sometimes pull-ups. Yeah, so we'll try those kinds of things. Another thing I'll do with this kid is I'll like lay on their feet and have them push me because I can be a really heavy leg press if I need to. And that gives them a lot of that like proprioceptive feedback. If I'm pushing really hard and I can go slow, I can kind of control the speed there too. So that's been a pretty good one as well. After we've done some of those activities, we'll work on catching. Sometimes we'll catch with a heavy ball. I just have to be careful with that because catching heavy ball is harder to catch than a regular ball. But usually what we'll do is we'll do a heavy work activity, then we'll work on the catching. When I can tell our focus is starting to go, we'll do another heavy work activity, and then we'll do the catching. I'll do the alternating strategy with a lot of kids, with this one in particular. I just kind of go till I can tell I'm like losing focus again and we need to recenter. Full disclosure here, this is totally my own daughter. So this is working with her as a therapist father. We have a goal to work on catching. And she is definitely a seeker. To prove that to you, I have this little video. It's going to be a video in a video. I can't get it to play in this format. So here you go. Please enjoy. I'll note that the first girl you see is her cousin. You'll be able to tell my daughter just based on how she moves. All right, hopefully you enjoyed that as much as I do. Maybe it's because I'm her dad, but every time I watch it, it just gets funnier and funnier. So you can see the differences between my daughter's cousin and her. My cousin, the cousin is, I'd say, a little bit more typical for a little girl doing her poses in a fashion show. And then my daughter's interpretation of a fashion show is to run around crazy. I shortened the video just a little bit, but they do poses next. And my daughter just goes, I'm going to do my crazy one again. So, you know, she's delightful, but she is a little bit crazy. But she's a lot of fun. So here's some final wrap-up thoughts. Sensory considerations can be a positive supplement to your treatments with children. And that's what I think they should be, a supplement. They should be a tool in your bag to help your treatments be better when you're working on their motor-based goals. And that's basically point number 2. This should be something that supplements and facilitates the things that you're working on with regard to their motor function. I would not recommend that it should be a standalone intervention, at least at this time. Maybe if we get better research and better protocols, we can. But right now, this is a really good supplement. Also note that this has to be specific to the child. We've made some generalizations today, and that's all they are. They're generalizations. So you're going to have to take that and apply it individually to each kid based on how they present that day. and as they progress throughout your treatments. Another thing is to be really careful with vestibular inputs, because if you're gonna maybe mess things up a little bit, it's going to be giving them too much vestibular input or calming them down too much. They may fall asleep. And when in doubt, do a heavy work activity that's appropriate for the kid, and you're going to be right like 90% of the time. The last thought, make it fun. So my references pretty much come from sensoryprocessingdisorder.com. I know there's a way to format that in appropriately, and I couldn't remember how to do it, and I didn't want to take the time to figure that out. The other one is, this is the booklet for the class that I took on sensory integration for speech therapists and physical therapists, and when it was presented. So I guess if you've got other questions, or if you really want to see the booklet I have, it's a little bit bare bones. So this is pretty much where I drew from, or some of my own clinical experience. And yeah, hopefully you learned some things today. If you've got further questions, feel free to ask Gloria and Joe. I know they know some of these things too, or you could send me an email, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you have. Thank you.